Good evening. It's such a great pleasure to be back in this temple of democratic politics in Seattle, where last time I appeared, I was a contradiction in terms. I was a Greek economist. 3 years later, I've been through the experience of having become Greece's finance minister. You know what fun it was to enter the finance ministry on the 27th of January 2015. Within an hour or so, the first thing I tried to do was I convened a meeting of Treasury officials. Sat them around the table. They were very displeased to see me. They were part of the ancien regime. But very soon, you know how it is with civil servants, you have to get along. The question that was meant to melt the ice was, so how are we doing funding-wise as a government? And one of them said, the leading light in the Treasury said, Minister, things are not too bad. And I said, okay, can you please define not too bad? And the answer was, we have 11 days left. So from being a Greek economist, suddenly I became the finance minister of a bankrupt state. 3 days later, I had my first formal visitor. A gentleman going by the name of Jeroen Dijsselbloem. It took me some time to learn how to pronounce that. The finance minister of the Netherlands, who was coming to see me in my office in his capacity as president of the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is a very interesting institution comprising all the finance ministers of European countries sharing the same currency, the euro. And within 5 seconds of our tete-a-tete meeting, we had several boring meetings with mandarins and aides before, but those are just a warm-up. When we go together, within 5 minutes, he said 5 seconds, he asked me an impertinent question. What do you intend to do with the economic policies that the previous government had accepted? What he meant was the policies that he and the troika of Greece's lenders had imposed upon the Greek state before we were elected. And I tried to give him a moderate answer. To say, Jeroen, there are 2 principles here that are clashing with one another. There is the principle of continuity. So when a new government is elected, it's not year 0. The state still has commitments to other states and other international institutions that were taken up and signed by previous governments. And of course, we have to maintain these commitments to some extent. But at the same time, there is also the principle of democracy, because we were elected to challenge this program. And what happens in a democracy and amongst democratic nations when 2 principles clash? We find a compromise. We find some common ground. And I thought that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I was very deluded. Actually, I didn't think that. I'm just joking. And the response came. It was completely anticipated, by the way. The response was, if you do not implement that program, and if you insist on having this program renegotiated, your banks will be closed by the 28th of February, less than a month. And suddenly, I am of the generation, we grew up in a military dictatorship. Greece's democracy was dissolved on the 21st of April of 1967, when the tanks rolled down Syntagma Square. Suspended the constitution, arrested thousands. This was, if you want, a warm-up for what happened in Chile in 1973 and in other places. This was my childhood, and it's part of the prologue, the introduction, the preface to the book. And I was thinking when he was telling me this, those dictators in 1967 were very inefficient. Instead of using the tanks, they could have used the banks. A few months later, the banks were closed, and our government was defeated. We, myself and the Greek Prime Minister, my friend and colleague Alexis Tsipras, were divided. We fell out, politically, not personally, not at a human level. And the result was the capitulation. Now, why should you care about it? I don't think that Greece should matter, even to the rest of Europe. It's a pipsqueak of a state, small place. The fact that for all those years, all the way here in Seattle, in New York, in Brazil, in China, newspaper articles are written about Greece. Imagine if in the United States of America, the great state of Delaware was threatening to destabilize this nation for 7 years. I submit it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that if that were the case, it would not be a problem with the state of Delaware, it would be a problem with the State of the Union. And therefore, my thesis is going to be partly that what really makes Greece substantial and significant is that it is the canary in the mine. Remember, the miners used to have canaries in cages so that if there is a methane release, the canary dies, and this acts as an early warning that there is a problem. Now, the canary did not cause the methane explosion, but it is simply serving a purpose of dying in order to forewarn others. This is Greece. My compatriots are suffering a Great Depression for 7 years now, and the best way of thinking about it is that little Greece has again managed to signal to the world that there is a problem with the world, not with Greece. I said again, did you notice that? Do you know what else started in Greece except for the Euro crisis? The Cold War. Who remembers that the Cold War did not begin in Berlin, but it began in the streets of Athens in December 1944, and that the Truman Doctrine, which signaled America's involvement in Europe in a posture that gave rise to the Cold War, was a result of Greece. So to have started one catastrophe is bad enough, we managed to start two. But anyway, so you will allow me not to say too much about Greece. I'll just make a few passing references. I won't talk about our world. I won't talk about Seattle, about the United States, about China, about Europe, because we are one ecosystem, economic ecosystem, which is not doing very well, and hasn't been doing very well, at least since 2008. Arthur Miller once said that an era has come to an end, to its end, when its own illusions have become exhausted. And by golly, the illusions of our era have become terribly exhausted, haven't they? Think about the conviction of generations of Americans that the next generation, their kids, will be better off than they are. That ended some time ago. Think of the idea of social mobility, the American dream, that through hard work and application, everyone can rise up. Well, there is not a single study of social mobility in the United States and in Europe that does not confirm, unfortunately, the hypothesis that social mobility has never been lower since at least the early parts of the 19th century. When I was growing up as a political animal in the 1970s, I remember, and many of you will remember, that the debate between the left and the right was on the basis of, on the side of the free marketeers, the pro-capitalist argument was that capitalism has some nasty aspects to it. It is a bit like a jungle, but this Darwinian process by which there is a feedback mechanism, an adaptive mechanism, which selects for success and selects the companies and the practices and the commodities and the ways of managing business that are more successful. This natural selection yields progress. And then on the left, you had the argument that this natural selection often fails to produce progress, often produces a great deal of injustice, inequality, and needs to be ameliorated through political redistribution of wealth. That was the kind of debates that I grew up with. That is gone. Have you noticed that this is, I mean, maybe in some textbooks, you may still find it. But think about it. In 1991, the left was soundly defeated. Friedrich von Hayek, the great libertarian philosopher, once said that socialism can only be implemented by means that most socialists would disapprove of. And he was right, wasn't he? I mean, I know very well, I am standing here in front of you as an unapologetic left-winger. But I know that if I lived in the Soviet Union or in Bulgaria or in Romania, I would be in the Gulag, and somebody like Hillary Clinton would be in the Politburo. An aside, my father, who was in a concentration camp as a left-winger between 1946 and 1950-51, told me once that when he was in the concentration camp as a left-winger being tortured by neo-fascist guards and so on and so forth, nevertheless, he said to me, beware of our own side, the left. Because when I was in there, he said to me, I was convinced that if my side had won, I would still be in the same concentration camp, only the guards would be different. So the left must retain a sense of guilt. I'm a left-winger who understands the responsibility of the left for the Gulag, for turning against other leftists, for the civil war tendencies of us leftists, of denouncing each other and dividing and multiplying. I don't know how many of you remember the opening scene from Monty Python, where they're all sitting there, the Liberation Front of Judea, the People's National Front for the Liberation of Judea, and they all hate one another. Yeah, that's the left, isn't it? This sectarian tendency and a great deal of authoritarianism that comes from a messianic belief that we are right, we are on the right side of history. There's nothing more depressing and toxic than this conviction that we are on the right side of history because we've read Marx or something. At least that illusion ended in 1991. Now, in 2008, another illusion ended. That we have capitalism. And that capitalism is this Darwinian process that selects companies, commodities, and manufacturing processes that are most efficient. Remember what happened in 2008 and has been happening ever since? The most failed corporations and the most failed corporate barons received the largest share of social wealth in the history of humanity in the form of bailouts. This is Darwin stood on his head. You get rewarded the more you have failed, as long as you're a banker. Yeah? So from 1991 onwards, we do not have capitalism. We have something that I have enjoyed a lot referring to as bankrupttocracy. Rule by the most bankrupt bankers. The more bankrupt you are, the more power you have. If you've lost a few billion, you're nothing. But if you've lost 300 billion, then you rule the universe. Yeah. So, let me rephrase Hayek a bit. Remember his dictum that socialism can only be implemented by means that most socialists would disapprove? Well, economic liberalism today can only be implemented by means that no liberal would approve of. In my country, for instance, in order to get rid of a left-wing government and to implement what the establishment believes to be economic liberalism, they actually had to use a coup d'etat. They had to close down our banks by means of the European Central Bank, which is quite deliciously ironic. Because the reason why we created central banks, let me remind you why we created in this country, you created the Fed. You created it in order to keep the banks open. Yeah? That's why we have central banks. We didn't always have central banks. We created central banks because whenever there was a financial crisis, the banking system melted down and people lost their money, and there was toxic ripples that run through the economy. And we created the Fed, the central bank, in order to stop that from happening. So if a bank is solvent and illiquid and there is a bank run, the central bank is there in order to keep it afloat. In my case, the same central bank, the European Central Bank, that a few months before I moved into the ministry, had declared the Greek banks to be solvent. Now, whether they were solvent or not is another matter. But the central bank declared them to be solvent after painstaking quality assurance tests and stress tests and all those tests. Yeah? Of course, the banks were not solvent, but are there any banks that are solvent? No. They are only solvent because we pretend that they are solvent and that we keep bailing them out and we have the central banks keeping them open. In our case, they did not keep open our banks. Why? In order to defeat the government that they didn't like, in the name of economic liberalism. So Hayek has his uses, and not just in order to lambast socialism. He can be also used in order to lambast conservatism. Think about it. All these huge bailouts that are taxpayer funded, they're not conservative. Where is the conservatism in giving the Greek state 110 billion euros in 2010? This is the largest loan, it's about $130 billion. The largest loan in the history of the world went to the most bankrupt of European states. Now, how conservative is this? They keep saying that they want to impose austerity and they've been imposing austerity. Where is the austerity in this? I mean, last time I checked, the Protestant ethic, the spirit of capitalism, the sense of austerity, of belt tightening, what does it mean? It means you don't borrow. If you have lost money, you take the consequences of that. You suffer, and you tighten your belt. But in Greece, do you know why I'm not the finance minister of Greece? Because I refused to take more money from European taxpayers when I didn't believe I could repay them, these monies. Now, you can't get more conservative than that. I was being lambasted for not taking 85 billion euros. And the reason why I didn't take that money was because I did the mathematics, the arithmetic, and just did not add up. I could see that if I did take it under the strings, with the strings attached, that the creditors wanted me to accept, it was perfectly impossible for me to repay the old debts and the new 85 billion. But because I couldn't be absolutely sure about that, well, I could, but it's always good to double check. I asked a certain person going by the name of Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, whether she thought that my calculations were wrong. And I didn't ask her in a private session. This was in the Eurogroup. And she admitted that my calculations were right. And then I asked the president of the European Central Bank, and he admitted that their calculations were wrong. And then I asked the finance minister of the Federal Republic of Germany, Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble, if he was prepared to back this particular deal that was being pushed down my throat in the Bundestag, the federal parliament in Berlin. And he said no. But at that point, the conversation ended because the president of the Eurogroup, that wonderful gentleman from Holland that I mentioned before, interrupted the proceedings, looked at me, and he said, it's a take it or deal it, or deal it. It's a take it or leave it deal, Yanis. And I thought, this is very interesting. This is a wonderful take on democracy and economic rationality and conservatism. Here you have the elected finance minister of a member state of the European Union, which is supposed to be the beacon on the hill of democratic politics throughout the world, being forced to take money by creditors who are clearly not interested in having their money back. This defies logic. Do you know of any other creditor that attach strings to the loan agreement that guarantee that they will not get their money back and insist on you taking money from them? Or else, Armageddon is being promised. This is what we've come to. And again, I want to make the point that this is a symptom of a global malaise of global capitalism, which has not managed to recover from the inevitable crisis of 2008. Let me do something that I could not have done 3 years ago when I was in the same place, simply because back then I was an economic theorist. The beauty of those short months, actually very long, few months, that I spent in the ministry and negotiating with these people, the beauty is that for the first time in my life I do not need to theorize. Because, you know, the powers that be told me the truth behind closed doors. Let me, through 2 or 3 short tales, extend this experience of mine to you. It was about the 15th day I was in the ministry. And it was my first meeting with the good people from the International Monetary Fund. We spent 10 hours, 10 long and tedious hours, with committees, with aides, discussing the minutiae of our debt sustainability analysis. It was all senseless. It was just, as I said, before you get to the crunch, to the serious discussion that happens many hours later, you have to go through these motions. Anyway, towards the end of the night, at around midnight, I was in the same hotel lobby having a drink with a top-notch official. You can't get more top-notch than that at the IMF, whose name will not be mentioned. We were having this drink, very friendly, after a whole day of disagreeing utterly. Because what I was trying to explain was that the policies they were imposing on my country for the last 5 years had created a Great Depression. Let me just put it very briefly. We lost 1/3 of national income. 1/3. 1/3, that's a lot. That's the grapes of wrath. Steinbeck. Actually, it's worse. Unemployment went from 8 to 28%. 1 in 2 families in Greece don't have a working member. I'll repeat this once more. 1 in 2 families do not have a working member. There has never been a more spectacular failure in an IMF program, anywhere in the world. And no sign of green sprouts of recovery. No light at the end of the tunnel. This is why I was elected. Why do you think I was elected? I would never have been elected. My party had 4% of the vote in the previous election, and we added a 0 to it. We went from 4 to 40%. Why? Because of the Great Depression, which led to the collapse of the political center. And what the one promise I had made to the electorate was, I'm going to speak truth to power. I'm going to say to them, you've been extending and pretending the Greek crisis through more unsustainable loans being piled up on existing unsustainable loans, and you've been doing it under conditions that shrink one's income. It's a bit like having a friend who for some reason has an economic crisis. They lost their job, they have, their pay was cut, and they can't meet their mortgage repayments. And somebody gives them a credit card to draw from on a monthly basis to repay the mortgage, on condition that this person will shrink his or her income. Now, how old do you need to be to understand that this is not going to end well? 8? 10? Not older than that. Huh? So there we were. I was trying to explain this to this person of the IMF all day through committees and graphs and dynamic macroeconomic modeling, as if you need any of this. Anyway, midnight, tete-a-tete, glass of whiskey. And I hear this person say to me something that did not initially compute. But I want to share it with you. She said, oops. She said, Yanis, look, you're right. This program can't work. I thought, what? She's telling me this? You know, sometimes we radicals, deep down, we would like to think that those in authority know what they're doing and we are wrong. When those in authority turn around and say to you, you know, you're right, then I panic. I don't know about you, but I panicked. At that moment, I panicked. I thought, oh no, I'm right. But what was worse was what followed. You see, the statement, these policies can't work, is very powerful. It's not the same as saying it's difficult for them to work. They can't work. Impossible. And then followed the sentence, but Yanis, we have invested so much political capital in this program, we cannot take it back. And your credibility, my credibility, depends on you accepting it. Now, do you get the point? The powers that be know that they are following dead-end policies. But it's the politics and the investment of the whole establishment in those dead-end policies, which makes it impossible for them to get out of that hole that they have dug for themselves. And the result is a constant, slow-burning crisis permeating throughout the globe, sacrificing human well-being, sacrificing whole generations. The crisis takes many different forms. It's not the same everywhere. In Greece, it's the Great Depression. In Germany, the very same crisis has a different symptom. It has a symptom of crashed pension funds. And savers, conservative savers in Bavaria, in Stuttgart, and so on, who see their pile of savings diminish because of negative interest rates. In France, there is an existentialist crisis of the state. China is becoming the new Greece, in the sense that it has an unsustainable currency and unsustainable debt, which it has to keep increasing so that China remains still. That's Greece before 2008. And it's one thing for little Greece to blow up. It's quite another if China, or when China blows up. The news will not be good from China. We can discuss this later if you wish. The second story that I want to share with you. It is about democracy. The simple point that I want to make with this story is that when you have political capital being invested in dead-end policies, you will end up with terrible economic outcomes. The terrible economic outcomes cause voters in America, in Germany, in Greece, everywhere, to lose trust in the institutions, in the political process, in the government, in the political system. And then what happens is, those in power require increasing degrees of authoritarianism in order to remain in power and to continue to extend and pretend to continue to impose the same failed policies. The ones that they have invested so much capital in. So, now let me relate the story of my first Eurogroup meeting. I was, as the rookie in the room, it was my first meeting as the finance minister of Greece, I was invited to speak first and outline our policies. And I tried to be, again, as moderate as I could. Not at all left-wing. Indeed, somebody that I'm going to mention in a few minutes, when he looked at my speech, the transcript of my speech, he said, "Oh, you sounded like a Wall Street bankruptcy lawyer." You know, Wall Street bankruptcy lawyers do this business every day. They renegotiate and restructure debts, corporate debts, that several corporations a day find difficult to repay. And they renegotiate between their bankers and the corporation a new agreement that makes it possible for the bank to claw back as much value as possible while the company gets restructured. Think of General Motors. This is the extreme case when its debt was very seriously restructured in 2009. The company was restructured, and the result is that General Motors doubled its profits last week. Otherwise, it simply would not exist. It would be a Greece. It would be shrinking all the time. The only thing about countries, thankfully, is that you just don't completely and utterly shut a country down, even if it is bankrupt. But companies do. Anyway, so this was more or less the gist of my speech. How can we make moderate changes to the Greek economic policies that were being imposed by the Troika before us, so as to permit an increase in investment to take place through a shock of optimism by reducing the amount of debt repayments that the Greek state would have, while at the same time cutting taxes. It took a radical left-winger to go to the IMF and bargain for a reduction in the corporate tax rate. This is how bad things have become. And the reason why it is important to do this is because when you have a Great Depression, capital and labor suffer. Industrial capital. You know, businesses go out of business. Entrepreneurs are finding it impossible to pay taxes and wages and to invest a little bit into increasing their efficiency. So at that point, there's an alignment of interests between the left and capital. And that is the moment when you realize how terrible the situation has become. So I was making all these points. I thought they were pretty modern and rational. My advisors from all sorts of different countries and all sorts of different political persuasions claimed that this was a very good speech and a very good program. Wolfgang Schäuble puts his hand up and he says, "Elections cannot be allowed to change the economic policy of Greece. Because if they are allowed to change the economic policies of Greece, then every time we have elections in Europe, there will be changes to the economic policies." And then I asked to speak for the floor, and I said, "Wolfgang, this is the greatest gift you could have made to the Chinese Communist Party. Because this is precisely what they think too." The contempt for democracy, which is prevalent in those decision-making bodies, not just in Europe, here, everywhere, is worse than in China. The difference here is that this contempt is dressed up in liberal democratic wrapping paper. Now let me tell you my third story. It took place again in a hotel lobby, again after midnight. Again over whiskey, with a certain gentleman whom I think you've heard of. I'll tell you his name, but first let me tell you what happened when, out of the blue, I received a phone call from him. I didn't know him at all. And he offered to come to my assistance as one of my advisors to guide me, to help with, technically as well as politically. And because we needed all the help we could get, I said, of course. But I also had to warn him. I said, "Larry, do you realize that in my Global Minotaur, the book that I spoke about 3 years ago here, I refer to you constantly as the Prince of Darkness. And he said, well, at least I'm a prince. Well, in that conversation, he said something that really struck me as poignant. We were discussing primary surpluses and tax rates and reforms to the pension funds and all those technical things. But I could see that his eyes were glazing over. He wanted to talk about something else. And he stopped me. And he said, Yanis, I'm going to ask you a question that is a little bit offbeat, off the beaten track of our conversation. But it is very important for you to make this decision, to make a decision now. You have a choice to make. And tell me what it is so that I know and so that I can calibrate my assistance to you accordingly. I said, okay, sure. Larry, what is it? He said, well, by the way, let me tell you first that you've made a very big mistake. I thought, okay. When Larry Summers tells you that you've made a very big mistake, it's always intriguing to know what he means. He said, you won the election. You shouldn't have won the election. You're in an impossible situation. Anyway, beyond that, he said, now that you've won the election and you're the minister, you've got to understand that there are two kinds of politicians. They are the outsiders who speak their mind and address audiences, and they get acclaimed for being truthful and honest. But the system gets rid of them. It jettisons them. It ejects them. It vomits them. And then there are the insiders. If you become an insider, you'll be given more leeway, more information, more power to make some changes within the system. But the price you have to pay is that you don't talk to people out there about other insiders, and you never turn against other insiders. At that point, I said to him, I told him a story of what had happened a few days before when I was in my office. My office was pretty ugly, but it had a beautiful view of Syntagma Square, Constitution Square. This is the square where the tanks rolled in 1967 in front of Parliament. It's where all the political demonstrations take place in Greece. Syntagma means constitution, and it's been named as such because the only reason why Greece got its first constitution was because there was a massive demonstration in the 1830s there in front of Parliament, which was back then the palace of the Bavarian king. We have a long tradition of interesting forms of government in Greece. And I told Larry the story of what had happened when the US ambassador, together with some representatives of the Treasury here from Washington, came to see me, and they were pushing me towards, they were trying to find out to what extent I was prepared to compromise with the lenders. And the answer I had given them was, I'm going to compromise in the morning, compromise in the afternoon, and compromise in the evening. It's the only way of establishing common ground and coming to an honorable agreement. But I am not going to be compromised. There is a profound difference between compromising and ending up compromised. So I'm not going to sign on an agreement whose numbers do not add up and which effectively extend Greece's debt bondage ad infinitum. So this is, and when the US ambassador was pushing me a bit further, I said to him, Mr. Ambassador, do you see that square out there? Beautiful view from a very large window of Syntagma Square. I said, my natural habitat is that square, demonstrating with thousands of others against this office. So anybody who pushes me to sign an unsustainable loan agreement and another fraudulent loan agreement just in order to extend and pretend failed policies into the future, well, you might as well do your worst and push me out there. I'm going to be much happier out there demonstrating again against this office. So I told Larry Summers that. He said, no, so you will be an outsider, won't you? I said, yeah. He said, well, you won't last. And I didn't. Let me start wrapping this up so that we can have a nice conversation after this. There's so much to say, but I will spend the last 4 or 5 minutes of this talk to implore you to think of Seattle, of Washington State, of the United States as exceptionally close to Greece, but also exceptionally close to China, to Europe, to India, to the rest of the world. This is one global village. We have increasingly fences, electrified fences and borders separating our peoples, but our destinies are utterly and completely interwoven. The new dealers that steered this country and global capitalism out of the mess of the Second World War knew that. Bretton Woods, which was the global design that created the 2 first decades after the war as the golden era of capitalism, a period of decreasing inequality, of increasing growth, of very low inflation. This was a result of a global design. It was not a result of America recoiling within America, of Europe recoiling within Europe. We created a common space. And it was under the tutelage and under the guidance of new dealers, men, usually men, they were men, who had experienced the Great Depression and the grapes of wrath in their bones. They had suffered from it. And they were determined never to allow this to happen again. The result was an interesting global design which proves one thing, that if you have the political will and the unity of purpose, it is possible to stabilize the world in a way that technological progress can go hand in hand with decreasing inequality, stability, and the dream of shared prosperity. Now that period ended, and this is how the second and third chapter, first, second, and third chapters of my book, it introduces the problems of Europe to the reader. The reason why this system broke down was because this system was predicated upon the hegemony of the United States, which took the form of recycling America's surplus value, surplus money, surplus profits to the rest of the world. Not out of philanthropy, but out of pragmatism. That the only way that I can have a surplus with you is if, and maintain it, is if I take part of my surplus and invest it in your country or region. Because if I don't, then the incomes in your region will start fading and you will not be able to buy my net exports. And then I will lose my surplus. So enlightened selfishness was, if you want, the main factor of the 1950s and 60s. Tragically, it was combined with incredible imperialism and the Cold War mindset. But the reason why Bretton Woods collapsed was America lost its surplus. It slipped from a surplus to a deficit position. And when the American administration understood that, and it was not just Republican, it was President Nixon who on the 15th of August 1971 essentially dismantled the system, and all hell broke loose with a new boisterous and audacious capitalism that depended on financialization, the explosion of inequality, the explosion of exploitation of workers beginning here in the United States and then spreading elsewhere. That created a brave new world that collapsed in 2008. But those 2 decades between 1944, let's say, and 1971, prove beyond reasonable doubt, at least in my mind, that it is possible not to civilize capitalism. As a left-winger, I don't believe you can civilize capitalism, but you can stabilize it. And you can create checks and balances that are such that give humanity an opportunity to catch up with its breath and to lick its wounds and to mind and to look after the weaker members of society. My book has a title, "And the weak suffer what they must," but the emphasis is on the question mark. And the answer I want to give is that no, they suffer that which they didn't have to suffer. Our technologies, our institutions are perfectly capable of ensuring that we live in a much more rational and democratic world. But that will require, firstly, action at the local level, but action at the local level which is guided by an internationalism, the opposite of the attempt to retreat from one's responsibility to the Chinese, to the Europeans, to everybody else, in exactly the same way that the New Dealers understood in the 1940s that America's interests lie in stabilizing the global economy. Finally, let me remind you once again, Greece only matters because it's a litmus test for the failures of our global design. And if I can bring you and end with a modicum of optimism, in Greece we were defeated last July. There is no doubt about that. But it was only one battle in a very long war. What really matters to me was that a small nation rose up against the bankrupttocracy, against the toxic terrorizing of voters by the systemic media. Every day there was Armageddon on television screens if our government was elected, if they voted no to the ultimatum of the Troika, if Greece continues to defy the powers that be. And the Greek people gave us a 62% support in the referendum of the 5th of July. This is just a small message of hope to all those who feel that there is an alternative, that astonishingly there is an alternative. So let's do away with Tina and replace her with Tatiana, that astonishingly there is an alternative. Thank you.
We do have a fairly limited time for questions, about 15 minutes, and then just a reminder to use the mics and keep them fairly short.
I'll go ahead. Do you favor dropping the euro and going with your own currency in Greece?
I'm in Washington State. Yesterday I was in California, and my answer usually it comes in the form of what I call the Eagles doctrine. Do you remember the song Hotel California, the last verse? You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So I happen to be one of these people that campaigned in the 90s against entering the euro, but I don't believe that it would be right to have a policy of exiting. It's one thing to say you shouldn't have gotten in. It's quite another to say that you should get out. Because once you're in, the path that led you to get in doesn't exist anymore for you to reverse upon. If you try it, you fall off a cliff. And to be very precise, to bring the drachma back would require a process of at least 10, 12 months. This is how long it takes to print a currency from scratch. And when you declare that you're going to bring it back, then everybody tries to liquidate their property, to bring it out of the country. No one invests in a country that is going to devalue in 10, 12 months. So the answer is no.
It seems that a conversation of debt forgiveness would have been foremost in front in the conversation. Did you find it was almost a forbidden topic to broach on whether debt forgiveness was a possibility or not?
Well, it's very interesting you should say that. Remember Henry Kissinger once said that when I want to talk to Europe, I don't have a telephone number. I don't know who to talk to. He was right, I felt that. Because when I talked to the president of the ECB, the European Central Bank, on this matter, he agreed. I spoke to Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF. Not only she agreed, but she was more radical than I was. Because I was aware of the political difficulty in Germany for the Chancellor, Merkel, to go to the federal parliament and say, okay, let's cut 40% of Greece's debt. She would have it would be a poison chalice for her to do this. So I was trying to create debt relief by using financial engineering methods that look as if there is no haircut when there is one. And I had Christine Lagarde and Paul Thompson, her deputy, saying to me, no, we have to take 60 billion immediately and burn it. So there was discussion. But the problem was, as I said, you talked to one creditor, you got one view. You talked to another creditor, you got a second view. Germany was divided. You talked to the finance minister, you got one view. To the chancellor, a completely different view. The two dislike each other very seriously. But where does that leave you? And my view always was that until and unless we could emit a signal that we are simply not going to pay another penny and let all hell break loose, until and unless they get their act together and they come to us with a decent proposition. This was always my view. This is the agreement I had with Alexis Tsipras, that if we get into government, this is what we would do. Unfortunately, a couple of months down the road, we were split. There was a wedge that was driven between us, and the result was surrender.
After the events you just described, you went on to found DM25. Love to hear about it. I'm involved with a group of people pursuing an American counterpart in solidarity with our European friends to do something similar. So I would love to know your thoughts about DM25, a counterpart in the United States, what the parameters might be that could lead possibly to some success. To pursue the same thing. The problems are different between the two sides, Europe and the United States, but there is something in common, which is a democracy deficit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this question, because what keeps me alive these days after the resignation, because you must understand that at a personal level, that defeat, especially given that it was caused by disunity amongst comrades and friends, this is very sad. And the next day, the day after, I had a lot of pressure from voters, from comrades, from colleagues, from friends, to start a new party. And I just couldn't bring myself to this. Because what would I be promising to the Greek people? That I'm going to do what? Elect me and I will do that which I didn't do last month. Okay, maybe I would have said that this time we will be united because, yeah, but it just did not motivate me sufficiently. And then I thought about it a bit more, and I thought that we had a small window of an opportunity to reboot not Greece, but Europe. To put an end to this kind of toxic, anti-democratic process. Because the problem that Europe has, of course the United States has it too, but to a lesser extent, is the complete democratic vacuum in Brussels. So you have democratic states, but the decisions are being made in a European Union institution where there is no democracy. There is no democratic deficit. It's like saying that there is an oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen. Yeah? And in the United States, let me put it this way. In the United States, if you still had 12% unemployment after 2008, and the same people were in power today as they were in 2008, the same apparatchiks, the same functionaries, and they kept saying the same thing, that, you know, promising in 2016 that the policy that they were advocating since 2008, which never worked, now will work, only we need to apply it even more thoroughly. I think there would be a political revolution here. They would have been wiped out. In Europe, they are not wiped out because we don't have this. So, to cut a long story short, it took one trip to France to give me this idea that if we're going to do something, it has to be pan-European. Not in Greece, not in Germany, not in France, not in Portugal. And there was a French politician who invited me to go to a small village close to the border with Switzerland, a place called Frangy. And it was summer, but it was raining. It was raining cats and dogs. And I was told it would be an open-air gathering. I thought, village in the middle of nowhere in the sticks. There were 10,000 people with umbrellas. And they stayed there for 3 hours in the pouring rain. It wasn't because they cared so much for me. Or it wasn't because they came to lend their solidarity with Greece. You know why they were there? They were worried about themselves, about their hospitals, their communities, their town hall, their pensions, their jobs, their children, the education of their kids, all these things. So at that point, together with another 10, 20 people throughout Europe, we decided we're going to try something out that had never been tried before. We're going to join forces across borders and across political party lines. Because the parties that exist now, just like here, are not fit to purpose. They are only nominally democratic, Republican, socialist, neoliberal. As I said, there's nothing neoliberal about increasing tax rates and giving tax-backed, unsustainable loans to a country, to a bankrupt country like Greece. And there's nothing left-wing about what the Greek government now is doing when they are cutting pensions. So we need to go beyond the political parties that we have are now traps for those who possibly begin with the illusion that they will change the world, and very quickly the world changes them. So we have created DiEM, the Democracy in Europe movement. Please visit our site, dm25.org, and even become members. Maybe we can have Seattle as part of this.
I'm a member. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a very simple agenda. The agenda is, firstly, to campaign vigorously throughout Europe for transparency. Because when I was in those meetings, being an outsider in Larry Summers' terms, I felt so strongly that if only the people out there could listen and watch what we were saying on their behalf, what a great difference that would make to the world we live in. Huh? Firstly, because what people say would improve massively in quality. Secondly, because the decisions that would be reached would increase in quality. And if they didn't, then the people out there would be so damn cross with them that they would have gotten rid of them. So transparency is the first step. The second step is, I mentioned the New Deal. We need a Green New Deal for Europe, and we need a Green New Deal for the world. I know that it sounds too general, but we have a project of within 2 years coming up with very detailed proposals of pragmatic changes that can be effected tomorrow. Not pie in the sky revolutionary stuff, you know, we'll all be tall, blonde, and Swedish. But things we can do, ways of redeploying existing policies and institutions. Let me just give you a very brief example. For years, central banks have been printing money in the hope of stimulating the economy by buying paper assets from the banks, hoping that the banks would then have cash and they will want to lend it to households and to small businesses to invest in, and therefore stimulate the economy. Well, it doesn't happen, because when investors fear that the level of demand will be low, even if somebody gives them free money, they will not invest. They will take this money and they will buy houses, creating asset price inflation, which is not helping. Or they will buy back their own shares in order to increase the share value, to increase their bonuses. Again, that does not create jobs, it does not stimulate the economy. Imagine, however, if you have a New Deal kind of approach, where you have a public investment outfit, which issues its own bonds, sells them to investors who will want to buy them if the Fed promises to intervene in the secondary markets to keep their value up. Instead of printing money in order to purchase mortgages and to purchase government debt, print money to purchase the bonds that will finance investment. That's just an example. I could give you a lot more, but there are lots of people standing. So these are the things we're trying to do with DM. And the final step will be to start a process, a grassroots process, for scripting together, collaboratively, a European Union democratic constitution, to replace all these toxic neoliberal treaties which impose upon Europe rules that cannot be implemented. Not just rules that are bad for us, but because they cannot be implemented, even if we want to, even if God and her angels come down on earth. It can't be done because they're silly rules. So, visit dm25.org and have a look at what we're doing. Thank you.
And I'll send you the plans we're making to make a counterpart. Here, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry for making you wait so long, because I talk too much.
That's all right. Yeah. Just a couple of things. I read somewhere that you described some financial officers in Europe as financial terrorists. There is a famous Facebook page called Goldman Sachs Financial Terrorist. I would like to hear a little bit more from you about financial terrorism, please. The second thing is, I feel that we have given the financial system of the whole world to the drunk gamblers on Wall Street. That's how I feel, actually. And I also wonder, we have a model in a state called North Dakota where they have a state bank owned by the state itself. Why do you see that as a good model, that actually we have public banks instead of private bankers running the whole system, gambling with everything? Why don't we have state banks to put our money in and stuff like that? The second thing is, do you feel that we as people somehow give power to the bankers by somehow, many of us, not all of us, but many of us, borrowing money to live beyond our means? Do you feel that we somehow, by our own behavior, participated in that kind of thing? Thank you.
Thank you. On the first question, look, when the president of the Eurogroup came to my office and said, cut pensions. Look, Greek pensions had been cut between 2010 and 2014 12 times, and to the tune of 40%. That is a substantial reduction. And they wanted me to cut pensions even further. And you know what they wanted? They wanted me to cut the lowest of the low of pensions. There are pensioners in Greece that have to live on $300 a month. They wanted me to take this down to $200. Now, how misanthropic can you get? And when they are saying to me that either you do that or I'll close your banks down, and then in the end they close the banks down and bring our government down, and now the government is passing this diminution of the lowest of the low of pensions from 300 to 200. Yeah? When this happens, what do you call that? I call it terrorism. Because terrorism is the pursuit of political means through the spread of fear and terror. So think about it. Imagine if tomorrow morning the banks in Seattle did not open and the ATMs did not function. And the reason why that happened was not because there was a problem with the banks, but because it was Janet Yellen who overnight had this epiphany of blackmailing Jack Lew and President Obama to reduce Social Security. Now that sounds preposterous, doesn't it? It's what happened to us a year ago. It's what happened to us. Now, if this happened to you, I believe you would have called Janet Yellen a financial terrorist. Now, on the question of state banks, we need state-owned, not necessarily run by politicians, but state-owned public investment banks. Like the World Bank. The World Bank is a state-owned investment bank, the European Investment Bank. We need, in an environment, look, everybody thinks about this crisis as a crisis of debt. It's a mistake. Not just the Greek crisis, but what's happening here in the United States. Everybody freaks out about the debt. Well, don't freak out about the debt. It's, you know, it's like having a patient who has a terrible disease, a bad disease, and you're freaking out about the pain. The pain is a symptom. You should freak out about the cause. The cause of the crisis and the debt is that we have the largest level of savings in the history of humanity, the largest level of savings worldwide. and the lowest level of investment. It's this disparity. Very high savings, very low investment, which is causing the problem. Why? Because when you have lots of savings, it means you have low consumption worldwide, relatively to what it would have been had the savings been lower, and it's not being invested. So there are no new incomes to generate the money from which to repay the debts. And then the mountain of debt looks so large only because incomes are not large. So the market is not going to solve this problem. The only way the market can do this, to bring savings and investment closer together, is if the interest rate falls. But the interest rate is zero, it can't go below. Yeah? And if it does go below, it kills off all the banks. And that can't be allowed to happen, can it now? And it won't help anyway. So how do you stimulate investment? This is where you need the public investment bank that mops up the liquidity and puts it into infrastructure, into education, into health, into green energy, into sustainable technologies, into the Green New Deal. On the last point, look, the last thing I'm ever going to do is blame individuals for being, for having fallen into the trap of the last 30 years. It is true that some people overborrowed, but fundamentally, what has happened in the United States in particular is this. In 1973, 2 centuries of constant wage growth was reversed, and median real wages started coming down, and they have never recovered. For 20 years, consumerism was maintained through indebtedness. So think about it, this is very cunning. It's beautiful, actually. If it wasn't so tragic, it would be beautiful. Instead of giving wages, higher wages to workers for increasing productivity, productivity has been going up very fast, but wages haven't. So instead of paying them in proportion to the output that they've been producing, their wages are constant and actually falling, and the ruling class, through the banks, is allowing them to borrow part of their profits and to repay it with interest to them. So they profit twice. Firstly, from their surplus value, and secondly, from the interest rate. So, of course, in 2008, this whole thing collapsed, and then you had foreclosures, and now you have blue-collar workers in the United States who are both underpaid and over-indebted. And when that happens, the sirens of fascism are always there. And in this country, they have a name, Donald Trump.
I really apologize, but we have time for one more question, which is this gentleman right here,
folks.
and I'm so sorry.
I'll speak on behalf of all the other people that didn't get a chance.
Thank you.
You gave arguments, you articulated very well arguments to the Troika that even a 10-year-old or even an 8-year-old could understand. But you were talking to them, and you were as if you were talking to a goldfish. And the issue, it seems to me, is not the economics, which you articulated very well. It was the politics.
Correct.
And my perspective is that this was a political question involving the elite, the financial elite of Europe and the world, versus the canary in the mind, a la the people of Greece, and that what might have been more appropriate or more effective, that is, was instead of going and arguing that to them on economic terms, to talk to the people of Greece about mobilizing on political terms, on a political level, to, in preparation to the onslaught that was going to be leveled upon them by the Greek elite, financial elite. Do you think in retrospect it would have been a better approach than the approach that you took that didn't work?
That's a great question. Great question. You're right. We should have done a lot more of that. There's no doubt. We should have prepared our people a lot more. A couple of points, if I may. In September 2014, I was still teaching at Austin, but I was in constant communication with the party in Greece because we knew that an election might be around the corner. We didn't know for sure. And the agreement had already been made between myself and Alexis Tsipras, who became Prime Minister, that we would have, that I would be the Finance Minister if we win. But the economic program of our party, which we had agreed would go through me first, since I would have to implement it, was announced without my consent, without my knowledge. These are the great failures of organization. And when I read it, I wasn't pleased. And I wasn't pleased because of the reasons that you are putting forward. There were too many promises and not enough preparation of the war that was coming. So the next day, I got so annoyed that I sat down in Austin and I wrote an article, which was published immediately in a Greek newspaper. The title says it all: Blood and Tears. And I was explaining that this is the only thing we should be promising the Greek people. Like Winston Churchill, blood, toil, and tears. This is all we can offer you in exchange of liberation and in exchange of turning the page. So we were amiss on this. There's no doubt about that. But we did have a secret weapon. We did have a weapon that we could have used. The only reason why I left Texas to go to Greece and stand for parliament and be part of this government was because Alexis and I had this agreement on the strategy of how we would retaliate if they closed the banks down. It's a technical issue now. We would have unilaterally written down off a chunk of debt we had towards the central bank. And that would have created serious problems to the central bank at a legal level, not so much financial, because they print as much as they want. And that would have brought down their whole strategy for saving the Eurozone. And we had this agreement. It was a cast iron agreement between us. And the Troika managed to split us on this. And when it came to the crunch, I put it to him, they're now threatening seriously to close our banks down within a few weeks. We have to tell them very clearly that this is what we're going to do in retaliation to stop them. And I was vetoed on that. And our people out there didn't know it. Because this is not the kind of strategy that you can discuss out in the open. But that we should have prepared them for blood, toil, and tears. You're absolutely right.